There's a sound that car engines make when they've been running too long in the cold. Not a rattle exactly. More like a persistent hum that settles into the background until you stop noticing it altogether. The kind of sound that makes you wonder, later, how long you've been sitting there. How much time has passed while you were somewhere else in your mind. On the night of February 5, 2023, a gray Nissan Altima sat in the southeast parking lot of Steele Indian School Park in Phoenix, Arizona. The engine was running. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing in particular, just empty asphalt and the quiet expanse of a 72-acre park after dark. Someone would have heard it if they'd walked past. That steady mechanical rhythm. The kind of thing that makes you glance over, maybe wondering if someone's waiting for someone else. Or if they're on a phone call. Or if they've just pulled over for a moment to collect themselves before driving the rest of the way home. But no one walked past. Not right away. The park was mostly empty. The night was quiet in the way Phoenix nights get quiet when the city finally exhales after sunset, when the desert cold settles in and people retreat indoors, away from the darkness that seems wider somehow than darkness in other places. The car kept running. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Inside the car, there was a woman. 29 years old. She had driven this route before, the 2.25-hour stretch of highway between Yuma and Phoenix. She knew the way the desert opened up along Interstate 8, the way the landscape shifted from agricultural flatness to the sprawl of the valley. She had made this drive enough times that it probably didn't require much thought anymore. Just muscle memory. The kind of trip where you arrive and barely remember the journey. Except this time, she didn't arrive. Her name was Karissa Danielle Hamilton. And by the time someone found her that night, sitting in her car with the engine still running, she had already been gone for hours. Maybe longer. The police wouldn't be able to say for certain. But the engine was still running, which meant it couldn't have been too long. Car batteries don't last forever. They die. They give out. They stop. But hers was still going. Karissa wasn't supposed to be at Steele Indian School Park that night. Or maybe she was. That's one of the questions that would linger afterward, one of the many things that people would turn over in their minds, trying to make sense of a sequence of events that seemed to stop mid-sentence. She had been in Yuma that weekend. A family event. A baby shower. The kind of gathering where people take photos and eat cake and make plans for the future. Ordinary. Warm. Safe. Her family would remember her being there. They would remember her seeming fine. Happy, even. There was nothing unusual about the weekend. Nothing that stood out. Nothing that made anyone think, later, that they should have paid closer attention. That they should have asked more questions. That they should have told her to stay one more night. She left Yuma around noon on Sunday. The drive back to Phoenix was something she'd done before. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't complicated. Just a straight shot east, then north into the city. 2 hours and 15 minutes if you didn't stop. A little longer if you did. No one knows if she stopped. No one knows what time she actually arrived in Phoenix, or if she went somewhere first, or if she meant to go to the park at all. The timeline has gaps. Spaces where the story should continue but doesn't. Hours that are missing, unaccounted for, lost to silence. What they do know is that by late evening, her car was in that parking lot. Engine running. Lights on. And Karissa was inside, slumped in the driver's seat, a single gunshot wound ending a life that had been moving forward just hours before. Her mother's name was Sylvia. Sylvia Hamilton had raised Karissa on her own for most of her life. She was her only child. The kind of bond that forms when it's just the two of you against the world. When you're not just mother and daughter, but each other's person. The one you call first. The one you tell everything to. The one whose voice you need to hear when things go wrong. Except Karissa didn't call. Not that night. Not when she should have. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, not dramatically wrong, not alarm bell wrong, but just off. The kind of wrong that makes you check your phone again. That makes you wonder if you missed a text. If maybe she's just busy. If maybe her phone died. If maybe she'll call in a few minutes. Because Karissa always checked in. She always let people know where she was. It was one of those small, reliable things about her, the kind of habit that makes people feel safe. That makes them assume everything's fine because if it wasn't, she would say something. She would reach out. But she didn't. And by the time Sylvia realized something was truly wrong, by the time the worry turned into panic and the panic turned into frantic phone calls to hospitals and police stations, by the time the family started driving around Phoenix looking for a gray Nissan Altima in a city full of gray cars, by then, it was already too late. The police had already found her. The call came in around 11 p.m. A report of an injured person at Steele Indian School Park, near the intersection of Central Avenue and Indian School Road. Officers responded. Firefighters responded. They found the car in the southeast lot, near where the park borders the Arizona State Veteran Home. The engine was still running. That detail would stick with people later. The engine. Still running. As if Karissa had only just arrived. As if she'd only just pulled into the parking spot and put the car in park and was about to turn the key and step outside. As if any second now, she might do exactly that. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Because when the first responders reached the car and looked inside, they found Karissa unresponsive. A single gunshot wound. They checked for a pulse they already knew wouldn't be there. They radioed for confirmation they didn't need. And at some point in those moments, probably quickly, probably with a kind of practiced efficiency that comes from having done this too many times before, the Phoenix Fire Department pronounced her dead. Dead at the scene. That's the language they use. Clinical. Factual. A phrase that doesn't capture the violence of what happened or the silence that came after or the fact that somewhere, a mother was still waiting for a phone call that would never come. Karissa had moved to Phoenix 6 months earlier. August 2022. A fresh start. A new chapter. All those phrases people use when they're trying to build something better. She had come from Yuma, a small city on the Arizona-California border where she'd grown up. Yuma was home. It was familiar. It was where her family was, where her roots were, where she knew the streets and the people and the rhythm of daily life. But it was also small. Limited. The kind of place where opportunities can feel finite, especially if you have big dreams. And Karissa had big dreams. 2 bachelor's degrees. One in criminal administration from Northern Arizona University. Another in sports journalism from Arizona State University. That's not something you do casually. That's not something you stumble into. That takes planning. Discipline. A clear vision of what you want your life to look like. She wanted to be a sports journalist. Not just wanted, needed. It was the thing that lit her up. The thing she talked about with the kind of certainty that makes other people believe it too. She wanted to be on the sidelines. In the locker rooms. Covering games. Telling stories. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of sports, basketball, football, cricket, you name it. Her great-uncle would later say you couldn't stop her once she started talking about it. You couldn't stop her. But you can stop someone. It turns out you can. She lived with her mother and stepfather when she moved to Phoenix. Not because she had to. But because it made sense. Because she was saving money. Because she was building towards something, and sometimes building means living in the in-between for a while. Her son lived with her too. Kyrie. 3 years old. The center of everything. People who knew Karissa would say the same thing over and over afterward. Everything she did for Kyrie. Every decision. Every sacrifice. Every long drive between cities, every late night studying, every plan for the future. It was all for him. She was a good mother. That's what Sylvia would say later, her voice breaking. She was a good mother. And Kyrie loved her. Respected her. The kind of bond that doesn't need explanation. Karissa was building a life. Slowly. Carefully. One deliberate step at a time. And then, in a parking lot on a Sunday night in February, someone ended it. The park where they found her sits in central Phoenix, just north of downtown. Steele Indian School Park used to be the site of the Phoenix Indian School, a boarding school where Native American children were sent, often forcibly, between 1891 and 1990. It's a place with a heavy history. A place that holds pain in its soil. Now it's a public park. 72 acres of open space, walking paths, grassy fields, and parking lots. During the day, it's full of life, people jogging, families picnicking, kids playing. But at night, it empties out. The lights get dimmer. The spaces get wider. It becomes the kind of place where you might pull over if you needed a quiet spot to make a phone call, or to collect your thoughts, or to meet someone. But why would Karissa have been there? That's the question no one can answer. She lived on the other side of town. She had no known reason to be at the park. No plans to meet anyone. No history of going there. And yet that's where she ended up. In a parking lot on the southeast side, engine running, life gone. The police began their investigation immediately. Homicide detectives took over the case. They processed the scene. They looked for witnesses. They canvassed the area. They followed every lead they could find. But there were no witnesses. Or if there were, they didn't come forward. The park had been mostly empty that night. The surrounding area quiet. No one reported hearing a gunshot. No one reported seeing anything unusual. It was as if the violence had happened in a pocket of silence, a moment that passed without anyone noticing. And the leads? They didn't go anywhere. Not publicly, at least. No arrests. No suspects named. No clear motive. Just a case file that grew colder with each passing week. 9 months later, Karissa's family stood in front of news cameras and pleaded for help. Her mother Sylvia. Her aunt Patricia Breenza. Her great-uncle David Giles. They stood together in a room full of reporters and police officers and silent witness representatives, and they talked about Karissa. Not as a victim. Not as a case number. But as a person. Karissa was very kind and humble, Sylvia said, her voice steady but strained. She liked doing things for people, but she always did it in the background where she didn't expect recognition. Patricia talked about the void Karissa's death had left. There's a big void in our lives, she said. She was the one that filled it. David talked about her dreams. Her knowledge. Her unstoppable drive. You couldn't stop her, he said. But someone had. And whoever that someone was, they were still out there. The family had put up $8,000 of their own money as a reward. Silent witness added another $2,000. $10,000 for information leading to an arrest. $10,000 for answers. But the answers didn't come. The case remained unsolved. The questions remained unanswered. And somewhere in Phoenix, someone knew what happened in that parking lot on the night of February 5, 2023. They knew. And they said nothing. There are things people remember about someone after they're gone that they wouldn't have thought to mention before. Small things. Habits. Quirks. The way they laughed, or the specific phrases they used, or the fact that they always ordered the same thing at restaurants. With Karissa, people remembered her quietness. Not shy, exactly. Just reserved. The kind of person who listened more than she spoke. Who observed. Who took things in before reacting. Her mother Sylvia would say she was humble to a fault, that she did kind things for people without wanting credit, without wanting attention. She'd help and then slip away before anyone could make a fuss about it. She liked doing things for people, but she always did it in the background, Sylvia would recall later, trying to put into words what made her daughter different. What made her special. She didn't expect recognition. There's a certain loneliness in that kind of kindness. In being the person who's always there for others but doesn't ask for much in return. The person who solves problems quietly. Who carries weight without complaining. Who makes things easier for everyone else while shouldering their own struggles alone. Karissa didn't like being alone. That's what her family would say. She didn't like it. She preferred having people around. Preferred the comfort of familiar voices and familiar faces. But she also didn't demand that comfort. Didn't reach out when she probably should have. Didn't say when things were hard. And maybe that was part of what made what happened so incomprehensible. Because if Karissa had been scared, if she'd felt threatened, if something had been wrong, wouldn't she have said something? Wouldn't she have called her mother? Wouldn't there have been some warning, some signal, some indication that she needed help? Unless it happened too fast. Unless there was no time. Unless the danger came from somewhere she didn't expect. Kyrie was everything to her. Her son. 3 years old. The kind of age where kids are fully themselves, walking, talking, developing personalities and preferences and opinions about everything. The kind of age where they remember. Where they form attachments. Where they understand more than you think they do. Karissa and Kyrie had a bond that her family described as special. Not just mother and son. But genuinely connected. He loved her. Respected her. And she structured her entire life around him. Every decision came back to Kyrie. The move to Phoenix, that was for Kyrie. For better opportunities. For a future that was bigger than what Yuma could offer. The 2 degrees, those were for Kyrie. So she could build a career that would support him. So she could give him the kind of life she wanted him to have. The journalism degree wasn't just a backup plan. It was the dream. Sports journalism. She had the knowledge for it. An encyclopedic understanding of sports that impressed even the people who'd known her for years. Basketball, football, cricket, she knew the stats, the players, the history. She could talk about it for hours if you let her. And she wanted to make a career out of it. Wanted to be courtside, in press boxes, telling stories about the games she loved. But dreams take time. They require patience and planning and small steps that don't always feel like progress. So she worked. She saved. She lived with her mother and stepfather in Phoenix. She took care of Kyrie. She built her resume. She applied for positions. She waited for the break that would change everything. She was 29 years old. Young enough that the future still felt wide open. Old enough to know that time moves faster than you think. And then someone took that time away. The weekend in Yuma had been normal. Completely, unremarkably normal. It was a family event. A baby shower. The kind of gathering where relatives come together and celebrate something happy. Where there's food and conversation and laughter. Where you take photos that you'll look at later and remember who was there, who said what, who made everyone laugh. Karissa had been there. Present. Engaged. Nothing about her behavior stood out as unusual or concerning. She wasn't withdrawn. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't looking over her shoulder or checking her phone obsessively or giving off any of the signs that something was wrong. She was just Karissa. Quiet. Kind. In the background, helping where she could. Her family would replay that weekend in their minds afterward, searching for clues they'd missed. Searching for some moment where she'd seemed off. Some conversation where she'd hinted at a problem. Some look in her eyes that suggested fear or worry or danger. But there was nothing. Just an ordinary weekend. Just family. Just Karissa being herself. And when she left on Sunday afternoon to drive back to Phoenix, there was no reason to think it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The drive from Yuma to Phoenix takes about 2 hours and 15 minutes if you take Interstate 8 east and then merge north toward the valley. It's a stretch of desert highway that millions of people travel every year. Flat. Wide. The kind of drive where you can set the cruise control and let your mind wander. Karissa knew this drive. She'd made it multiple times since moving to Phoenix. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't unpredictable. Just a long straight road through the desert, past agricultural fields and small towns, until the sprawl of Phoenix starts to appear on the horizon. She left Yuma around noon on Sunday, February 5th. That's what her family remembers. Midday. Plenty of daylight left. No reason to rush. No reason to worry. But somewhere between Yuma and that parking lot at Steele Indian School Park, something happened. The timeline gets murky. The hours blur. There's a gap, a space in the story where Karissa should have been driving home, should have been calling her mother to say she arrived safely, should have been walking through the front door and hugging her son and starting the routines of another ordinary Sunday evening. Instead, she ended up in a park she had no known reason to visit. In a car with the engine still running. With a gunshot wound that would kill her. The police couldn't say for certain how long she'd been there before someone found her. Hours, maybe. The medical examiner would have to determine time of death, and even that wouldn't be exact. Bodies don't come with timestamps. They offer approximations. Windows of time. Ranges of possibility. But the engine was still running when they found her. That suggested it hadn't been too long. Most car batteries will run for 2 to 4 hours before dying if the engine's on and the car's in park. Maybe longer, depending on the vehicle. Maybe shorter. Which meant Karissa had probably been in that parking lot for less than 4 hours when the call came in at 11 p.m. Probably less than 3. Maybe even less than 2. But where had she been before that? What had she been doing? Who had she been with? Those questions didn't have answers. Not public ones, anyway. Steele Indian School Park is not a place you pass through on your way from Yuma to most parts of Phoenix. It's central. Urban. Surrounded by neighborhoods and businesses. If Karissa had been heading to her mother's house, where she was living, she would have had no reason to go to that park. Unless she was meeting someone. Unless she'd been asked to stop there. Unless she'd pulled over for some reason that made sense at the time but later became impossible to explain. The park sits on land that used to house the Phoenix Indian School, a boarding school where Native American children were forcibly assimilated for nearly a century. It closed in 1990 and was eventually transformed into a public park. Now it's 72 acres of open space, walking paths, grassy fields, a canal running along one side, parking lots scattered throughout. During the day, it's busy. Joggers, families, people walking dogs. But at night, it's different. The lights are dim. The paths are empty. The parking lots become isolated pockets of darkness where a car can sit unnoticed for a long time. The southeast lot, where Karissa's car was found, borders the Arizona State Veteran Home. It's not the most visible part of the park. Not the most trafficked. If you wanted privacy, if you wanted to meet someone without being seen, it would be a reasonable place to choose. But there's no evidence that Karissa was meeting anyone. No texts. No calls. No plans. At least not that the police shared publicly. Which leaves the possibility that whatever brought her to that parking lot wasn't planned. That it happened spontaneously. That something, or someone, diverted her from her route home. Or maybe she went there on her own. Maybe she needed a moment alone. Maybe she pulled over to make a phone call or to rest or to think. Maybe the park was just a random choice. A quiet place to park for a few minutes before finishing the drive. But then how did someone find her? How did they know she'd be there? How did they get close enough to shoot her, once, just once, and then leave without anyone seeing? The questions compound. They pile on top of each other. And none of them have satisfying answers. The single gunshot is significant. One shot. Not a flurry of bullets. Not a sustained attack. Just one. It suggests intent. Precision. Someone who knew what they were doing. Or someone who got exactly what they wanted on the first try. It also suggests that Karissa might not have seen it coming. That there might not have been a struggle. That it might have happened so quickly she didn't have time to react, to defend herself, to try to escape. The police didn't release details about where she was shot. They didn't say whether the window was open or broken. They didn't say whether there were signs of a confrontation. They kept those details close, the way investigators do when they're trying to protect the integrity of the case. When they're trying to make sure that if they ever find a suspect, that suspect's knowledge of specific details will help prove their guilt. But the silence also meant that the public, the people who might have information, who might have seen something, who might be able to help, didn't have much to work with. Just a woman. A car. A gunshot. A park. It's not enough to build a theory on. Not enough to spark a memory. Not enough to make someone think, wait, I saw something that night. And so the case stalled. The leads dried up. The investigation continued, but quietly. Without breakthroughs. Without arrests. Without the kind of momentum that makes people believe justice is coming. Sylvia Hamilton waited for her daughter to come home that Sunday night. She waited the way mothers wait when their adult children are out, with a baseline of trust, a thread of worry, and the understanding that at some point, the door will open and the worry will dissolve and everything will be fine. Except the door didn't open. The hours passed. The worry intensified. The texts went unanswered. The calls went to voicemail. At what point does waiting become panic? At what point do you stop telling yourself that everything's probably fine and start admitting that something might be very wrong? For Sylvia, that point came sometime late Sunday night. When Karissa still hadn't arrived. When she still wasn't answering her phone. When the excuses started running out. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she stopped to see a friend. Maybe she got a flat tire and doesn't have service. But none of those explanations felt right. Because Karissa wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without explanation. She checked in. She communicated. She let people know where she was. So Sylvia started calling. Hospitals. Police stations. Anyone who might know something. And at some point during those frantic hours, probably in the early morning of Monday, February 6th, the confirmation came. The police had found Karissa. She was dead. And there were no suspects. No witnesses. No clear explanation for why her life had ended in a parking lot on a Sunday night. The world kept turning. Monday morning arrived. People woke up and went to work and lived their lives. And somewhere in Phoenix, a mother was learning that her daughter was gone. That her grandson had lost his mother. That the future they'd been building had collapsed in the time it takes for one person to pull a trigger. In the days after Karissa's death, her family struggled to make sense of what had happened. There was no obvious motive. Karissa wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't living a risky lifestyle. She was a mother, a student, a woman trying to build a career. She was quiet. Kind. Background. So why would someone kill her? Robbery didn't seem to fit. If someone had tried to carjack her, why would they shoot her and then leave the car running in a parking lot? Why not take the car? Why not take her belongings? A personal conflict didn't fit either. There were no reports of threats, no history of domestic violence, no recent arguments or breakups or disputes that would point to a specific person with a reason to want her dead. A random attack seemed unlikely given the location and circumstances. Random shootings tend to be messier. More chaotic. They happen in the moment, not in an isolated parking lot with no witnesses. Which left the possibility that someone had targeted Karissa specifically. That someone had a reason, known only to them, to want her dead. And that they'd either lured her to that park or followed her there and waited for the right moment. But who? And why? The police weren't saying. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they had theories they couldn't prove. Maybe they were waiting for someone to make a mistake, to talk to the wrong person, to give themselves away. Or maybe they had nothing. Maybe the case was already going cold. Maybe Karissa's murder would become another file in a cabinet full of unsolved cases. Another name on a list. Another family left with questions that would never be answered. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a violent death. Not the quiet of grief, which has its own weight and texture. But the silence of absence. Of questions that can't be asked because the only person who knew the answers is gone. Of conversations that will never happen. Of explanations that will never come. Sylvia Hamilton lived in that silence. Every day. Every hour. She would wake up in the morning and for a split second, just one brief, merciful second, she would forget. And then she would remember. And the remembering was like falling. Like the ground dropping out from under her all over again. Karissa was gone. Her daughter. Her only child. The person she'd raised and protected and watched grow into a woman with dreams and plans and a son of her own. Gone. And not in a way that made sense. Not in a way that felt like closure. Not in a way that came with answers. Just gone. And in her place, there was this terrible, consuming void. This absence that filled every room, every conversation, every quiet moment when Sylvia's mind drifted and she found herself thinking, I should call Karissa. And then remembering that she couldn't. That there would be no more calls. No more texts. No more Sunday drives from Yuma. No more ordinary moments that you don't appreciate until they're gone forever. The grief was one thing. The not knowing was another. Because if you're going to lose someone you love, you want it to at least make sense. You want to understand why. You want to believe that there was a reason, even if the reason is terrible. Even if it's unfair. At least it's something. At least it's an explanation. But Karissa's death didn't make sense. It was a gap in logic. A disruption in cause and effect. A woman drives home from a family gathering and ends up dead in a parking lot with no witnesses, no suspects, no motive, no explanation. It was like a sentence that stopped mid-word. Like a story missing its ending. And Sylvia was left holding the silence. Carrying it. Living inside it. Kyrie was 3 years old when his mother died. 3 years old. Old enough to know her. To remember her. To understand that she was gone and not coming back. But young enough that the full weight of that loss wouldn't hit him for years. Maybe decades. Right now, he just knew that his mother wasn't there anymore. That the person who'd been the center of his small universe, the one who fed him and held him and tucked him in at night, had vanished. And no matter how many times the adults in his life tried to explain it, the explanation didn't fix the absence. Where was she? Why didn't she come home? When would he see her again? Questions that don't have good answers. Questions that hurt to hear. Questions that made the adults around him search for words that wouldn't break a child's heart even more than it was already broken. Karissa had done everything for Kyrie. That's what everyone said. Everything. Every choice, every sacrifice, every plan for the future. It was all for him. To give him a good life. To build something stable and safe. To be the kind of mother he deserved. And then someone took her away. And Kyrie was left with a grandmother and a great-uncle and a family that loved him but couldn't replace what he'd lost. Couldn't fill the space where his mother used to be. He would grow up with that space. That hole. That absence. He would grow up knowing her only through stories and photographs and the memories of other people. He would grow up with questions that might never be answered. Questions like, who killed my mother? And why? The Phoenix Police Department's homicide unit took over the investigation immediately. They processed the scene at Steele Indian School Park. They documented everything. Photographed the car, the surrounding area, the position of Karissa's body. They collected evidence. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed anyone who might have been in or near the park that night. They did their jobs. That's not the question. The question is whether their jobs were enough. Because weeks passed. Then months. And there were no arrests. No suspects publicly named. No press conferences announcing a breakthrough. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes families wonder if the case is being actively worked or if it's already been set aside. If it's been moved to the bottom of the pile. If the detectives have moved on to fresher cases, cases with leads, cases that might actually get solved. Sylvia tried to be patient. Tried to trust the process. Tried to believe that somewhere, investigators were following leads, connecting dots, building a case that would eventually bring justice for Karissa. But patience is hard when you're living in the absence. When every day without answers feels like another day of letting whoever killed your daughter get away with it. When you start to worry that time is working against you. That witnesses are forgetting. That evidence is degrading. That the person responsible is getting comfortable in their freedom. The police wouldn't talk to the family about the investigation. Not in detail. They couldn't. That's standard procedure. They don't share information that might compromise the case. They don't reveal what they know or don't know. They keep their cards close. But from the outside, it looked like they didn't know anything. Like the case had stalled. Like Karissa's murder was becoming just another unsolved homicide in a city that sees dozens every year. And maybe that's exactly what was happening. 9 months after Karissa's death, her family decided they couldn't wait in silence anymore. They needed to do something. Needed to take action. Needed to make sure that Karissa's case didn't disappear into the bureaucratic void of unsolved crimes. So in November 2023, they organized a press conference. They partnered with Silent Witness, the anonymous tip line that offers cash rewards for information leading to arrests. They put up their own money, $8,000 of it, as a reward. Silent Witness added another $2,000. $10,000 total. $10,000 for anyone who could help solve Karissa's murder. The press conference was held at a community center. Reporters came. Cameras came. And Karissa's family stood up in front of all of them and spoke. Sylvia talked about her daughter. About who Karissa was beyond the headlines. Beyond the police reports and crime scene photographs. Karissa was very kind and humble, she said, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. She liked doing things for people, but she always did it in the background where she didn't expect recognition. Her Aunt Patricia spoke too. There's a big void in our lives, she said. She was the one that filled it. And she's not here. And we want justice. Her great-uncle David talked about Karissa's dreams. Her passion for sports. Her encyclopedic knowledge. Once she started talking, you couldn't stop her, he said. And then, quieter, but someone did. They pleaded with the public. If you know something, anything, please come forward. If you were in or near Steele Indian School Park on the night of February 5, 2023. If you saw a gray Nissan Altima. If you heard a gunshot. If you noticed anything unusual, no matter how small it seemed at the time. Please. Call Silent Witness. Help us find out what happened. Help us get justice for Karissa. The press conference got media coverage. Local news stations ran the story. Articles were published. Karissa's photo appeared on screens and in newspapers. The Silent Witness tip line number was shared widely. And then, nothing. Or at least, nothing that the public could see. Maybe tips came in. Maybe some of them were useful. Maybe the police followed up on every single one. But there were no public updates. No announcements. No arrests. Just more silence. More waiting. More absence. There are certain details about Karissa's case that stick with you once you hear them. Details that seem insignificant on their own but take on weight when you put them together. The engine was still running. That's one. The engine was still running when they found her. Which means she'd either just arrived, or she'd been sitting there with the engine on for a reason. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she'd pulled over to make a call. Maybe she was about to drive away. Or maybe someone else was in control. Maybe someone else had told her to keep the engine running. Maybe she never had the chance to turn it off. The single gunshot is another detail. One shot. Not multiple. Not a spray of bullets. Not a panicked, chaotic attack. Just one shot. Which suggests either incredible precision or incredible luck. It suggests someone who knew what they were doing. Or someone who got exactly what they wanted on the first try and then left. No robbery. That's the third detail. Karissa's car was still there. Her belongings were still there. Nothing appeared to have been taken. So if robbery was the motive, it failed. If carjacking was the goal, it didn't happen. Which means either the shooter was interrupted before they could take anything, or taking something was never the point. The point was Karissa. The point was making sure she died. And then there's the location. Steele Indian School Park. A place Karissa had no known reason to be. No history of visiting. No connection to. So either she went there voluntarily for a reason no one knows, or she was brought there. Lured there. Directed there. But by whom? And why? Those are the questions the family can't stop asking. Those are the questions that wake Sylvia up at night. That make her replay every conversation she had with Karissa in the weeks before her death. Every text message. Every phone call. Searching for something she missed. Some hint. Some warning sign. But there's nothing. Just an ordinary mother living an ordinary life. Making ordinary plans. And then dying in a way that makes no sense. The media attention faded quickly. That's what happens with most cases. There's an initial spike of coverage when the crime happens. Another spike when the family does something public, like a press conference or a vigil. But then the news cycle moves on. New crimes happen. New tragedies unfold. Reporters have to cover what's current, what's developing, what has momentum. And Karissa's case didn't have momentum. It had silence. And silence doesn't make for compelling headlines. So the articles stopped coming. The news segments stopped airing. And Karissa's story faded back into the realm of unsolved cases that only the people directly affected still think about every day. Except Karissa's family couldn't move on. They lived in the story. They carried it with them. Every day was another day without answers. Another day of wondering if today would be the day the phone rang with news. Another day of being disappointed. Sylvia kept Karissa's memory alive in the ways that grieving mothers do. She talked about her. She shared stories. She made sure that people knew Karissa wasn't just a victim. Wasn't just a name in a case file. She was a person. A daughter. A mother. A woman with dreams and plans and a future that someone stole. But keeping someone's memory alive doesn't bring them back. And it doesn't answer the question that matters most: who did this? There's a phenomenon in unsolved murder cases where the family becomes their own investigators. Not officially. Not with any kind of authority or access to evidence. But out of desperation. Out of the need to do something, anything, other than sit and wait and hope that someone else solves the case. They start asking questions. Talking to people who knew the victim. Retracing their last steps. Looking for connections the police might have missed. It's not that they don't trust the police. It's that they need to feel like they're contributing. Like they're fighting for justice instead of just being passive recipients of whatever the system decides to give them. Sylvia did this. She asked questions. She talked to people. She tried to piece together Karissa's final day. Tried to figure out where she'd been, who she might have talked to, what might have happened between leaving Yuma and ending up in that parking lot. But the answers didn't come. Or if they did, they didn't lead anywhere. They just created more questions. More gaps in the timeline. More spaces where something might have happened but no one could say for sure. And the frustration of that, of being so close to your daughter's life and still not being able to understand her death, was its own kind of torture. Phoenix is a big city. More than 1.6 million people. Sprawling. Diverse. The fifth largest city in the United States. And with that size comes a certain level of crime. A certain number of homicides every year. In 2023, Phoenix saw 154 homicides. That's 154 families left with grief and questions. 154 investigations. 154 cases competing for resources and attention. Karissa's case was one of 154. And while every case matters, while every victim deserves justice, the reality is that some cases get solved and some don't. Some cases have witnesses who come forward. Some have forensic evidence that points clearly to a suspect. Some have confessions or digital trails or security footage that makes the investigation straightforward. And some cases have none of that. Some cases are just a body in a crime scene and a whole lot of silence. Karissa's case seemed to be falling into that second category. No witnesses. No clear motive. No suspects. No breakthroughs. Just a young mother, shot once, found in a car with the engine still running. And somewhere in Phoenix, someone who knew exactly what happened and why. Someone who was living their life while Karissa's family lived in absence. Someone who thought they'd gotten away with it. There's a particular cruelty in unsolved cases. A specific kind of injustice that goes beyond the initial crime. Because when someone kills another person, they take a life. That's the first crime. The obvious one. The one that makes headlines. But when they get away with it, they commit a second crime. They take justice. They take closure. They take the family's ability to move forward. They leave them suspended in a permanent state of waiting. Of wondering. Of never quite being able to process the loss because the loss doesn't have an ending. It just keeps echoing. Keeps reverberating. Keeps refusing to resolve. Sylvia lived in that suspension. That limbo. That space between knowing Karissa was gone and understanding why. And every day that passed without answers was another day the killer got to live free. Another day they got to wake up and go about their business and pretend they hadn't destroyed multiple lives with one pull of a trigger. Another day Kyrie grew up without his mother. Another day the silence got louder. Time moves differently when you're waiting for answers that might never come. Days feel longer. Weeks blur together. Months accumulate like weight on your chest, pressing down a little harder each time another anniversary passes. Another birthday. Another holiday. Another Sunday afternoon when you catch yourself thinking about how things used to be. For Sylvia, time became a measurement of loss. Not just the loss of Karissa, but the loss of the future they'd planned together. The loss of watching Kyrie grow up with his mother. The loss of the career Karissa had been building. The loss of ordinary moments, phone calls, visits, Sunday drives, that you don't realize are precious until they're impossible. And underneath all of that loss was the constant, gnawing presence of the question that wouldn't leave her alone: who did this to my daughter? She thought about it while making breakfast. While helping Kyrie get ready for preschool. While lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and replaying every detail she knew about February 5, 2023. Searching for something. Some connection she'd missed. Some piece of information that would suddenly make everything make sense. But it never did. The pieces didn't fit together. The timeline had gaps. And the silence from the police department grew heavier with each passing month. Detective work is not like it appears on television. It's not dramatic confrontations and last-minute breakthroughs and puzzle pieces clicking into place right before the credits roll. Real detective work is tedious. Methodical. It's interviewing dozens of people who saw nothing useful. It's reviewing hours of surveillance footage that shows nothing relevant. It's following leads that go nowhere. It's paperwork and phone calls and databases and dead ends. And sometimes, despite all of that work, cases don't get solved. Sometimes the evidence isn't there. Sometimes the witnesses don't exist. Sometimes the killer makes no mistakes and leaves no trail and simply vanishes into the noise of daily life. The detectives assigned to Karissa's case were professionals. Experienced. They'd solved cases before. They knew how to work a homicide investigation. But knowing how doesn't guarantee success. Especially when you're starting with so little. No witnesses who saw the shooting. No surveillance cameras covering that specific parking lot at that specific time. No forensic evidence that pointed to a specific suspect. No digital trail, texts, calls, social media messages, that suggested Karissa was meeting someone or being threatened or was in any kind of danger. Just a body. A car. A single gunshot wound. And an engine that was still running. It's hard to build a case from that. Hard to generate leads. Hard to identify suspects when you don't know the motive. When you don't know if this was personal or random. Planned or spontaneous. Connected to Karissa's life in Yuma or her life in Phoenix or something else entirely. The detectives worked the case. They followed procedure. They did everything by the book. But the book doesn't always have answers. Sometimes it just has more questions. There's a statistic about homicide cases that most people don't know. In the United States, roughly 40% of murders go unsolved. That number has been creeping upward for decades. In the 1960s, police cleared about 90% of homicide cases. Now it's closer to 60%. And in some cities, it's even lower. Phoenix's clearance rate hovers around 60 to 65% in good years. Which means that roughly 1 out of every 3 murders in the city goes unsolved. 1 out of every 3 families is left waiting for justice that never comes. Karissa's family was becoming part of that statistic. Part of that 35 to 40% who live in the aftermath without resolution. Who carry the weight of unanswered questions for the rest of their lives. And the thing about being part of a statistic is that it makes you feel invisible. Like your specific pain, your specific loss, your specific need for justice is just a number. Just one more case in a long list of cases that the system couldn't solve. But statistics are made of people. Real people. Real families. Real grief. And being statistically common doesn't make the pain any less individual. Any less devastating. Any less urgent. Sylvia wasn't comforted by knowing that other families were going through the same thing. If anything, it made it worse. Made her angry. Made her wonder how many killers were walking around free because the system couldn't, or wouldn't, find them. How many people got away with murder simply because they were lucky or careful or both? How many people like whoever killed Karissa were out there right now, living normal lives, while the families they destroyed lived in permanent grief? Kyrie asked about his mother sometimes. Not every day. Not in the way an adult might ask, directly, looking for specific information. But in the way children ask about things they don't fully understand. Casual questions. Observations. Comments that would come out of nowhere and break your heart. When is mommy coming back? Where did mommy go? Does mommy know it's my birthday? And the adults in his life would have to figure out how to answer. How to explain something unexplainable to a child who just wanted his mother. How to be honest without being cruel. How to help him understand without traumatizing him further. They told him that his mother loved him. That she always would. That she wasn't coming back, but that didn't mean she'd stopped loving him. That she was gone but not forgotten. That they would make sure he always knew who she was and how much she cared about him. But those answers didn't fill the absence. They didn't make the reality easier. They didn't change the fact that Kyrie was growing up without the person who'd brought him into this world. Without the person who'd centered her entire life around him. He would have questions later. As he got older. As he started to really understand what had happened. He would want to know more. He would want to know why. He would want to know who. And the family would have to tell him that they didn't know. That they'd tried to find out. That they were still trying. But that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the answers just aren't there. That would be its own kind of loss. Its own kind of failure. Not being able to give him even that small piece of closure. That small piece of justice. The park where Karissa died didn't change. Life continued there. People still jogged the paths in the morning. Families still had picnics on weekends. Kids still played on the playground. The park absorbed what had happened and moved on, the way public spaces do. No memorial. No marker. Nothing to indicate that in that southeast parking lot, a woman's life had ended violently on a Sunday night in February. Sylvia went there once. Months after Karissa's death. She needed to see it. Needed to stand in the place where her daughter had taken her last breath. Needed to understand, somehow, why this location. Why this park? It was smaller than she expected. More ordinary. Just a parking lot. Asphalt and painted lines and a few scattered trees. Nothing ominous about it. Nothing that screamed danger. And that was almost worse. Because if the place had looked dangerous, if it had felt wrong, then at least it would make sense that something terrible happened there. But it didn't look or feel like anything in particular. It was just a parking lot. Anonymous. Forgettable. The kind of place you'd pull into without thinking twice. Which meant Karissa probably felt safe there. Or at least, not threatened. She'd pulled into that parking spot and put the car in park and left the engine running, probably thinking she'd only be there for a moment. Probably thinking everything was fine. And then it wasn't. Sylvia stood there for a long time, trying to feel something. Trying to connect to the space. Trying to sense Karissa's presence or understand what had happened. But there was nothing. Just an empty parking lot on an ordinary day. She never went back. The reward money sat unclaimed. $10,000. A significant sum. The kind of money that should motivate someone to come forward. The kind of money that might make someone who knows something decide that their silence isn't worth it. But months passed and the tip line stayed quiet. Or at least, it didn't produce anything useful. Maybe people called. Maybe they offered theories or rumors or speculation. But none of it led anywhere. None of it resulted in an arrest. Which meant either no one knew anything or the people who knew something weren't talking. Both possibilities were disturbing in their own ways. If no one knew anything, it meant the killer had been completely isolated in their actions. Had told no one. Had left no witnesses. Had covered their tracks so thoroughly that there was nothing for investigators to find. That level of control, that level of planning, it suggested someone methodical. Someone careful. Someone who knew what they were doing. But if people did know something and weren't talking, that was even worse. Because it meant the killer had people protecting them. Either actively, lying, providing alibis, hiding evidence, or passively, through silence. Through the decision that whatever they knew wasn't worth the complications of getting involved. Either way, the result was the same. Karissa's killer remained free. And her family remained trapped in the absence. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you can't win. Not physical exhaustion, though that's part of it. But emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of caring deeply about something when nothing you do makes a difference. The exhaustion of hoping for a breakthrough that never comes. The exhaustion of keeping your grief fresh and raw because you can't let yourself move on, can't let yourself heal, can't let yourself stop fighting for justice even though fighting is all you have left. Sylvia felt that exhaustion. It lived in her bones. Sat in her chest like a weight that never lifted. Made every day feel like climbing a mountain that had no peak. She wanted to rest. Wanted to let go. Wanted to accept that maybe Karissa's case would never be solved and that she needed to find a way to live with that. But accepting felt like giving up. Like betraying Karissa. Like telling whoever killed her daughter that it was okay, that they'd won, that they could stop looking over their shoulder and live their life in peace. And Sylvia couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that. Even if it meant carrying this weight forever. Even if it meant never sleeping soundly again. Even if it meant spending the rest of her life asking a question that had no answer. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was letting Karissa's murder fade into history. Letting her become just another name in a file. Just another statistic. Just another unsolved case that people shook their heads about and then forgot. Karissa deserved more than that. She deserved justice. She deserved answers. She deserved to have her life matter enough that someone wouldn't stop until they found the truth. Even if that someone had to be her mother. Even if it had to be forever. The police department issued periodic statements about the case. The investigation is ongoing. We continue to pursue all leads. Anyone with information is urged to contact Silent Witness. Standard language. Professional. Non-committal. The kind of statements that say everything and nothing at the same time. That acknowledge the case exists without providing any real information about its status or progress. Sylvia read those statements and tried to find hope in them. Tried to believe that ongoing meant active work was happening. That pursuing all leads meant there were leads to pursue. That someone, somewhere, was spending their days thinking about Karissa's case and working to solve it. But she also knew what those statements probably meant in practice. That the case was still open, technically, but not actively worked. That it was in a file somewhere, waiting for new information that might never come. That unless something changed, a witness came forward, a confession was made, a piece of evidence surfaced, nothing would happen. The case would just exist. Unsolved. Unresolved. Unforgotten by Karissa's family but forgotten by almost everyone else. And that forgetting was its own kind of death. A second erasure. First, Karissa's life was taken. Then, slowly, her story was fading from public consciousness. From the news cycle. From the list of cases people talked about and wondered about and demanded answers for. Soon, it would just be Sylvia and Kyrie and a handful of family members who still carried Karissa's memory. Who still demanded justice. Who still refused to let her become just another statistic. There are certain facts about Karissa's case that investigators would have focused on immediately. The lack of robbery. That's significant. It suggests the motive wasn't financial. Suggests this wasn't about taking her car or her belongings. It was about Karissa specifically. The single gunshot. That's significant too. It suggests intent. Control. Not a panic spray of bullets but one deliberate shot. Someone who either knew what they were doing or got incredibly lucky. The location. A park she had no known connection to. That's perhaps the most significant detail of all. Because it raises the question of how she ended up there. Did she go willingly? Was she meeting someone? Was she lured there under false pretenses? Was she followed? Each of these facts narrows the field of possibilities. Rules out certain scenarios. points towards certain conclusions. But without additional information, without witnesses, without forensic evidence, without a digital trail, those facts can only take an investigation so far. They can tell you what probably didn't happen. But they can't tell you what did. And so the detectives were left with a framework but no picture. A structure but no substance. A series of facts that suggested a targeted killing but couldn't identify the target's connection to the killer. It was like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces were missing. You could see the outline. Could get a sense of the shape. But couldn't complete the image. Couldn't see the full picture. Couldn't say with certainty what you were looking at. Sylvia thought about the last conversation she'd had with Karissa before she died. It had been ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of conversation you have 100 times and never think to remember because there's no reason to think it might be the last one. They'd talked about the baby shower. About when Karissa would leave. About the drive back to Phoenix. About Kyrie. About ordinary things. Normal things. Things that mattered in the moment but didn't feel significant enough to memorize. And now Sylvia would give anything to remember every word. Every inflection. Every pause. Every detail of that final conversation. Because it was the last time she heard her daughter's voice. The last time Karissa was alive and safe and just being herself. But the details were fuzzy. Blurred by grief and time and the desperate need to hold onto something that was already slipping away. She remembered the basics. Remembered Karissa seeming fine. Normal. Happy. Not worried or scared or giving off any indication that something was wrong. Just her daughter, being her daughter, having an ordinary conversation before an ordinary drive home. Except the drive wasn't ordinary. And Karissa never made it home. And that last conversation, whatever the exact words were, turned out to be the last time they would ever speak. If Sylvia had known that, would she have said something different? Would she have told Karissa to stay one more night? Would she have made her promise to call as soon as she got home? Would she have somehow sensed the danger and warned her? But you can't know. That's the thing about last conversations. You never know they're last until it's too late. And by then, there's nothing you can do except carry the weight of all the things you wish you'd said. There are stages to grief that people talk about. Denial. Anger. Bargaining. Depression. Acceptance. But when the grief comes from an unsolved murder, the stages don't work the same way. You can't move through them in order. You can't reach acceptance when there's nothing to accept except the fact that you'll never know. You can't bargain when there's no one to bargain with. You can't even properly direct your anger because you don't know where to aim it. So instead, you cycle. You spin through the stages over and over, never landing anywhere. Never settling. Never finding the solid ground that's supposed to come eventually, the place where you can stand and say, this happened, and it was terrible, but I understand it now, and I can live with it. You can't live with it. You can only live inside it. Sylvia lived inside it. Inside the not knowing. Inside the constant mental loop of questions that had no answers. Inside the exhausting work of keeping Karissa's case alive when the world wanted to move on. She joined online groups for families of murder victims. Read their stories. Recognized her own pain reflected back at her in different faces, different names, different cities. Found some small comfort in knowing she wasn't alone in this particular kind of hell. But she also found something else in those groups. A pattern. A trajectory that most unsolved cases followed. The first year, there's hope. The case is fresh. The investigation is active. The family believes that any day now, there will be a breakthrough. Any day now, the police will call with news. Any day now, justice will come. The second year, the hope starts to fade. The investigation quiets down. The updates stop coming. The family realizes that unless something dramatic happens, a confession, a new witness, a lucky break, the case is probably going to stay unsolved. By the third year, the family is fighting just to keep the case from being forgotten entirely. They're organizing their own searches for information. They're posting on social media. They're doing interviews with anyone who will listen. They're becoming their own investigators because no one else is doing it anymore. And after that, After the third year, the case becomes part of the family's identity. It's no longer something that happened to them. It's something they carry with them always. A permanent weight. A permanent absence. A permanent question mark. Karissa's case was approaching that second year. The year when hope fades. When reality sets in. When you start to understand that justice might not come. That the person who killed your loved one might walk free forever. Sylvia felt that shift happening inside herself. Felt the hope draining away like water through her fingers. And she hated it. Hated that she was starting to accept the possibility that Karissa's murder would never be solved. That Kyrie would grow up never knowing who killed his mother or why. But hating it didn't change it. Refusing to accept it didn't make it less true. The city of Phoenix moved on. That's what cities do. They absorb tragedy and keep functioning. They hold space for grief while simultaneously moving forward with the business of being a city. Roads get repaired. Buildings get built. Life continues. In the months after Karissa's death, there were other murders. Other investigations. Other families thrust into the same nightmare of loss and unanswered questions. The news cycle churned through them one by one. Headlines appeared and disappeared. Vigils were held. Pleas for information were made. And then those cases faded too. Some got solved. Some didn't. But either way, they eventually moved off the front page. Made room for the next tragedy. The next crisis. The next story. Karissa's story had already faded. Already moved into the archives. Already become something you had to search for rather than something that appeared in your feed. Her family fought against that fading. Posted on social media. Shared her photo. Reminded people that she existed. That her case was still unsolved. That someone out there knew what happened and was choosing to stay silent. But fighting the fading was exhausting. It required constant effort. Constant vigilance. And even then, it was a losing battle. Because the internet has a short memory. Because people's attention spans are finite. Because new tragedies happen every day and you can't expect strangers to carry your grief when they have their own struggles, their own losses, their own lives to live. Still, the family tried. Because what else could they do? Let Karissa disappear completely. Let her become just another name that no one remembered. Let her killer live in comfort knowing that the world had moved on. No. They couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that. So they kept posting. Kept sharing. Kept reminding. Kept fighting against the inevitable forgetting. There are practical concerns that come with a murder investigation that people don't think about unless they've lived through it. Like the fact that the victim's belongings become evidence. That you can't just clean out their room or go through their things or dispose of items you don't want to keep. Everything has to stay exactly as it was in case the police need to search it again. In case there's something relevant hidden in a drawer or saved on a computer or written in a notebook. Karissa's room stayed frozen. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her book still sat on the shelf. Her laptop still waited on the desk, probably locked now, files preserved for an investigation that seemed to have stalled. It was like a shrine. Or a tomb. A space that existed outside of time, holding onto a version of Karissa that was already gone. Sylvia couldn't bring herself to change it. Couldn't pack up the clothes or donate them or redistribute them to family members. Because doing that felt like giving up. Like admitting that Karissa was never coming back. Like accepting that this room would never be lived in again. And she knew, intellectually, that Karissa was never coming back. That this room would never be lived in again. But there's a difference between knowing something and accepting it. Between understanding a fact and letting yourself feel the full weight of its truth. So the room stayed frozen. And every time Sylvia walked past it, she felt the absence. Felt the weight of all the life that should have continued but didn't. Felt the unfairness of a world that kept turning while Karissa's world had stopped completely. Kyrie's 4th birthday came and went. It was a small celebration. Family only. Cake and presents and attempts at normalcy that felt performative rather than genuine. Because how do you celebrate when the person who should be there, the person who would have cared most about this day, is gone? Karissa should have been there. Should have been planning the party for weeks. Should have been the one holding Kyrie while he blew out the candles. Should have been taking pictures and posting them and making memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, Sylvia did those things. And she did them with love. Did them because Kyrie deserved to have birthdays celebrated. Deserved to feel special and loved and happy even in the midst of loss. But it wasn't the same. And everyone knew it. And the absence was there, in the room, like an uninvited guest that no one mentioned but everyone felt. Kyrie was starting to understand more now. Starting to grasp that his mother wasn't just away. That she wasn't coming back. That the word dead meant something permanent and unchangeable. He asked more questions. Harder questions. Questions that didn't have good answers. Who hurt my mommy? Why did they do it? Are they in jail? And the adults had to say, we don't know. The police are trying to find out. But they haven't yet. And Kyrie would accept that answer the way children do, reluctantly, incompletely, with a look in his eyes that suggested he knew there was more to the story but didn't have the tools yet to demand better explanations. Someday he would have those tools. Someday he would be old enough to read the news articles himself. To search for his mother's name online. To see the photos from the crime scene, the interviews with his grandmother, the pleas for information that went unanswered. Someday he would understand fully what had been taken from him. And the family dreaded that day. Dreaded having to watch him process the full scope of the loss. Dreaded seeing the anger and pain and confusion that would come when he realized that not only was his mother dead, but the person who killed her was never caught. Never punished. Never held accountable. That would be its own kind of trauma. Its own kind of theft. The detective assigned to Karissa's case had other cases. Dozens of them, probably. Active investigations that required attention and follow-up and the kind of intensive work that unsolved cases with no new leads simply couldn't justify. It wasn't personal. It wasn't negligence. It was just the reality of being a homicide detective in a major city. You had to triage. Had to focus your energy where it was most likely to produce results. Had to make difficult decisions about which cases got priority and which cases had to wait. Karissa's case was waiting. Not closed, but not actively worked either. Sitting in a file, ready to be reopened if new information came in. But without that new information, without someone coming forward with something concrete, there wasn't much the detective could do. You can't solve a case through sheer willpower. You need evidence. You need witnesses. You need something to investigate. And if those things don't exist, if the killer left no trail and told no one and made no mistakes, then the case just sits. Sylvia understood this on some level. Understood that the detective wasn't deliberately ignoring Karissa's case. That the system had limitations. That resources were finite. But understanding didn't make it easier. Didn't make the waiting less painful. Didn't change the fact that her daughter's killer was out there, free, while the people who were supposed to find them had moved on to other priorities. She wanted to be angry at the detective. Wanted to direct her rage somewhere specific. But she also knew that wouldn't be fair. The detective was doing their job within the constraints of a system that wasn't designed to handle the volume of violence it encountered. So instead, she directed her anger at the system itself. At a society that produced this much murder. At the gaps in the safety net that left cases like Karissa's falling through the cracks. At the fundamental unfairness of a world where some lives seemed to matter more than others. Because that's what it felt like. Like Karissa's life didn't matter enough. Like her death wasn't important enough. Like her case wasn't priority enough to justify the resources it would take to solve it. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not just living with the absence, but living with the feeling that the absence wasn't being taken seriously. That the system had already written off Karissa's case as one of the ones that wouldn't be solved. One of the statistics. One of the 40%. There were moments when Sylvia thought she saw Karissa. Not really, of course. Not literally. But glimpses. Shadows. Women on the street who had the same build, the same walk, the same way of wearing their hair. And for just a split second, her brain would misfire. Would think, that's her. That's Karissa. And then reality would crash back in. It wasn't Karissa. It could never be Karissa. Karissa was gone. Those moments were brutal. Like experiencing the loss all over again. Like being reminded, viscerally, that the person you wanted most to see was the one person you could never see again. Grief played tricks like that. Made you see things. Made you hope for things that were impossible. Made you forget, temporarily, the truth of what had happened. And then made you remember all over again, with fresh pain each time. Sylvia had read somewhere that this was normal. That seeing the deceased in crowds, hearing their voice, feeling their presence, these were all common experiences in early grief. The brain struggling to accept what the heart didn't want to believe. But knowing it was normal didn't make it less disorienting. Didn't make it less painful. Didn't make the moment of recognition, "Oh, that's not her," any easier to bear. The holidays were impossible. Thanksgiving. Christmas. New Year's. Mother's Day. Each one a reminder of absence. Each one a day that should have included Karissa but didn't. Each one a performance of normalcy that felt hollow. The family went through the motions. Gathered together. Ate meals. Exchanged gifts. Tried to maintain traditions for Kyrie's sake. Tried to create some sense of stability and continuity in the midst of ongoing trauma. But the traditions felt broken now. Incomplete. Like watching a play where one of the main actors is missing and everyone's trying to pretend the show can still go on. Karissa's absence was loudest during the holidays. During the moments when the family was supposed to be complete. When you were supposed to count your blessings and feel grateful and celebrate togetherness. How do you feel grateful when someone crucial has been ripped away? How do you celebrate togetherness when the person who should be there is gone? How do you count your blessings when the biggest blessing, having Karissa alive, has been taken? They tried. They made the effort. But underneath the surface, underneath the forced smiles and the attempts at cheer, there was grief. Constant, unrelenting grief. And anger. And the terrible knowledge that this would be the rest of their lives. Every holiday. Every birthday. Every ordinary Tuesday. The absence would always be there. Karissa would always be missing. And whoever killed her would probably never face consequences. Spring came to Phoenix. The brutal heat hadn't arrived yet. The city was in that brief window of pleasant weather between winter and summer. People were outdoors more. The parks filled up. Life bloomed. And in that southeast parking lot at Steele Indian School Park, nothing marked the spot where Karissa had died. No flowers. No memorial. No indication that anything significant had happened there. The park district had policies about memorials. They couldn't allow permanent installations for every tragedy that occurred on public land. It would be overwhelming. Unmanageable. So they had rules. Guidelines. Restrictions. Sylvia understood the logic. But she also hated it. Hated that there was no physical marker of Karissa's death. No place people could go to remember. No acknowledgement that this specific spot held significance. It felt like another erasure. Another way that Karissa was being forgotten. First her case went cold. Then the news coverage stopped. Then the public moved on. And now, even the place where she died offered no recognition that she'd ever been there at all. Just an empty parking spot. Asphalt and painted lines. Anonymous and forgettable. Sylvia thought about putting something there herself. A small memorial. Flowers or a cross or a photo. Something to say, this mattered. She mattered. What happened here should not be forgotten. But she also knew that anything she placed there would eventually be removed. Either by the park district or by weather or by time. Nothing she could do would be permanent. Nothing she could do would make the world remember Karissa the way she deserved to be remembered. So she didn't do anything. Just carried the memory inside herself. Carried it like a weight that would never lighten. Carried it because someone had to. Because if she didn't, who would? The second anniversary of Karissa's death approached. 2 years. 730 days. 17,520 hours. However you measured it, it was too long. Too long without answers. Too long without justice. Too long for a killer to walk free. Sylvia planned something for the anniversary. Not a celebration, you don't celebrate death, but an acknowledgement. A vigil, maybe. Or a press conference. Something to remind people that Karissa's case was still unsolved. That her family was still waiting. That someone out there still knew what happened and was still choosing silence. She reached out to local news stations. Some responded. Some didn't. The ones that did were polite but noncommittal. They'd see if they could send someone. They'd check the schedule. They'd let her know. It was hard not to feel like a burden. Like she was bothering people with her grief. Like she was asking too much by expecting others to care about her daughter's death 2 years after the fact. But what else could she do? Accept the silence. Accept the forgetting. Accept that Karissa's life and death didn't matter enough to warrant continued attention. No. She couldn't do that. So she kept pushing. Kept asking. Kept making herself a burden if that's what it took to keep Karissa's name in people's minds. Because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative was letting whoever killed Karissa get comfortable in their freedom. Letting them stop looking over their shoulder. Letting them believe they'd gotten away with it completely. And Sylvia refused to give them that comfort. Refused to let them forget that someone was still looking for them. Still demanding answers. Still refusing to let this go. Even if it took the rest of her life. Even if the answers never came. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from carrying grief that no one else understands. Not because people don't care. Not because they don't sympathize. But because unless you've lived it, unless you've woken up every morning to the absence of someone murdered, unless you've spent years waiting for answers that never come, unless you've watched the world move on while you're trapped in the same moment of loss, you can't truly understand it. People meant well. They said things like, "I can't imagine what you're going through," and they were right. They couldn't imagine it. And Sylvia was glad for that. Glad that most people would never have to understand this particular flavor of pain. But it also meant she was alone in it. Fundamentally, irreducibly alone. Even when surrounded by family who loved Karissa, who missed her, who wanted justice, they weren't living inside the same grief. They weren't Karissa's mother. They weren't the person who'd brought her into the world and was supposed to protect her and had failed. That last part was the worst. The feeling of failure. The irrational but unshakable belief that she should have somehow prevented this. Should have told Karissa not to make the drive that day. Should have sensed the danger. Should have done something, anything, to change the course of events that led to that parking lot. Intellectually, Sylvia knew this was survivor's guilt. Knew it was irrational. Knew that she couldn't have predicted what would happen. That she wasn't responsible for someone else's violence. But guilt doesn't respond to logic. It sits in your chest like a stone. It whispers that maybe if you'd been more attentive, more protective, more vigilant, your daughter would still be alive. And that whisper never quite went silent. The Phoenix Police Department's homicide unit received hundreds of tips every year. Most led nowhere. People called in with theories. Hunches. Vague recollections of seeing something that might or might not be relevant. Names of people they suspected for reasons that ranged from concrete to completely arbitrary. Some tips came from people genuinely trying to help. Others came from people with axes to grind, using tip lines to make false accusations against enemies or ex-partners or neighbors they didn't like. Some came from people with mental illness who confessed to crimes they didn't commit or reported conspiracies that didn't exist. The detectives had to sort through all of it. Had to follow up on the credible leads while filtering out the noise. Had to balance the need to investigate every possibility with the reality that their time was limited and most tips wouldn't pan out. For Karissa's case, there had been tips in the beginning. People who thought they'd seen something. People who had theories about what might have happened. People who wanted the reward money and thought they could provide information that would earn it. But none of the tips led anywhere. None of them provided the breakthrough the case needed. None of them pointed to a suspect with means, motive, and opportunity. So the tips slowed down. Eventually, they stopped altogether. And the case went quiet. Not closed. Just quiet. Waiting for something to break it open again. But what if nothing did? What if the tip that could solve the case never came? What if the person who knew what happened never developed a conscience or never got angry enough at the killer to turn them in or never got desperate enough for $10,000 to break their silence? What if this was it? What if the silence was permanent? Those were the questions Sylvia lived with. The ones that kept her awake at night. The ones that made her feel like she was drowning slowly, one day at a time. Kyrie started kindergarten in the fall. A milestone. A rite of passage. The kind of thing that should have been celebrated with photos and excitement and a mother's tears as she watched her baby grow up. Instead, it was another reminder of absence. Another moment that should have included Karissa but didn't. Another experience that Kyrie would navigate without his mother there to guide him. He was 5 years old now. Old enough to remember things. Old enough to form lasting memories of this time in his life. Which meant he was also old enough to remember that his mother wasn't there. That she'd been gone for most of his life. That he'd grown up in the shadow of her absence. Sylvia took him to school on the first day. Held his hand. Walked him to his classroom. Smiled and waved and told him to have a good day. And then went home and cried. Because this was supposed to be Karissa's job. Karissa should have been the one taking him to kindergarten. Should have been the one worrying about whether he'd make friends, whether he'd be scared, whether he'd cry when she left. Karissa should have been there for all of it. First day of school, first lost tooth, first birthday party with friends, first skinned knee, first everything. She should have been the constant presence in Kyrie's life. The person he ran to with good news. The person who comforted him when things went wrong. The person who shaped his understanding of love and safety and what it meant to be cared for. Instead, he had a grandmother doing her best to fill a role she was never supposed to have. And he had an absence where his mother should have been. And he had questions that no one could answer adequately. Why did someone hurt my mommy? Because some people do bad things, Sylvia would say, keeping her voice steady even as her heart broke. But why did they hurt my mommy? And what could she say to that? That there was no good reason. That violence often made no sense. That sometimes terrible things happened to good people and there was no why that would ever be satisfying. Those weren't answers a 5-year-old could process. Hell, they weren't answers a 50-year-old could process. So she'd hold him and tell him that she didn't know why, but that his mommy loved him more than anything, and that would never change. And Kyrie would accept that answer the way children do, not because it satisfied him, but because he didn't have any other choice. The true crime community had moved on from Karissa's case. There were podcasters who'd covered it briefly in the weeks after her death. YouTubers who'd made videos. Bloggers who'd written posts. The case had all the elements of a compelling mystery, a young mother, an unexplained death, no clear suspect, no obvious motive. But without new developments, without twists or updates or breaks in the investigation, the story lost momentum. Content creators needed fresh material. Audiences craved updates and resolutions. A case that just sat unsolved, month after month with nothing new to report, didn't generate views or downloads or engagement. So they moved on to other cases. Other mysteries. Other stories that had more forward motion. Sylvia understood this intellectually. She knew that strangers couldn't be expected to maintain interest in her daughter's case indefinitely. But emotionally, it felt like abandonment. Like the world had decided that Karissa's death wasn't interesting enough to warrant continued attention. She tried engaging with the true crime community. Posted in Reddit threads. Commented on YouTube videos. Reached out to podcasters asking if they'd consider doing an update episode on Karissa's case. Some responded kindly. Said they'd think about it. Said they'd keep it on their radar. But most didn't respond at all. And the ones who did never actually followed through. Because what was there to update? The case was still unsolved. The police still had no suspects. The family still had no answers. There was no new information to share. No development to report. Just the same tragic story with the same frustrating lack of resolution. And that didn't make for compelling content. That didn't keep audiences engaged. That didn't generate the kind of buzz that made covering a case worthwhile from a content creator's perspective. So Karissa's case faded from the true crime sphere. Became one of thousands of unsolved murders that got mentioned occasionally but never examined deeply. Never given the sustained attention that might actually help solve it. Another form of erasure. Another way that Karissa was being forgotten. There were nights when Sylvia couldn't sleep. Not because of noise or discomfort or any of the usual things that keep people awake. But because her mind wouldn't stop. Wouldn't stop replaying the timeline. Wouldn't stop imagining scenarios. Wouldn't stop asking questions that had no answers. What happened in those missing hours between when Karissa left Yuma and when she was found in the parking lot? Where did she go? Did she stop somewhere? Did she meet someone? Did she make any phone calls? The police had her phone records. They knew who she'd talked to that day. But they hadn't shared that information publicly. Hadn't said whether there was anything suspicious in her call history. Hadn't indicated whether she'd contacted anyone unusual or received any threatening messages. So Sylvia was left to wonder. To imagine possibilities. To construct scenarios in her head and then pick them apart looking for the logic that would make everything make sense. Maybe Karissa had been followed from Yuma. Maybe someone had been waiting for her to leave. Had tailed her all the way to Phoenix. Had waited for the right moment to approach her. But why? What would anyone in Yuma have against Karissa? She hadn't lived there in months. Hadn't been involved in anything controversial or dangerous. Hadn't had enemies or conflicts that would motivate someone to follow her across state lines and kill her. Maybe it was someone from Phoenix. Someone who knew she'd been out of town and was waiting for her to return. Someone who convinced her to meet at the park. Someone she trusted enough to pull into that parking lot and turn off her defenses long enough for them to get close. But who? Karissa wasn't dating anyone, as far as the family knew. Wasn't involved in any disputes. Wasn't connected to anything that would make her a target. Maybe it was random. Maybe she'd pulled into the park for some innocent reason, to make a phone call, to check directions, to rest before finishing the drive, and someone had seen an opportunity. Had approached her car. Had tried to rob her or carjack her or worse. And when she resisted or screamed or tried to drive away, they'd shot her. But that didn't fit either. Random violence was usually messier. More chaotic. And the single shot suggested purpose. Control. Intention. Round and round Sylvia's thoughts went. Building theories and dismantling them. Trying to find the explanation that fit all the facts. Trying to understand what had happened to her daughter. But understanding never came. Just exhaustion. Just the slow realization, as the sky started to lighten with dawn, that she'd spent another night chasing answers that didn't exist. The parking lot at Steele Indian School Park saw life every day. Cars pulled in and out. People came to walk their dogs or jog or play basketball or just sit in their vehicles and take a break from whatever was happening in their lives. The park absorbed all of this daily activity without comment. Without memory. Without acknowledgement of what had happened in that southeast corner on a February night. Sylvia drove past sometimes. Not often. But occasionally. When she needed to go somewhere in that part of town and the route took her close to the park. She'd slow down as she passed. Would look toward that section of parking lot. Would try to feel something. Connection. Understanding. Closure. But there was nothing. Just a parking lot. Just ordinary space that had witnessed extraordinary violence and then continued being ordinary. She wondered if the killer ever came back. If they drove past sometimes and looked at the spot where they'd ended a life. If they felt anything, guilt, fear, satisfaction, emptiness. Or if they'd moved on completely. If that night meant nothing to them. If Karissa's death was just something that happened once and then got filed away in their memory as a thing that was done and couldn't be undone and didn't need to be thought about anymore. The idea that someone could kill another person and then just continue their life normally was almost incomprehensible. But it happened. Statistically, it happened all the time. People killed and got away with it and went on to have jobs and relationships and families and normal lives while the people they'd killed stayed dead and the families left behind stayed broken. Maybe Karissa's killer was one of those people. Maybe they were out there right now, living their normal life. Going to work. Coming home. Eating dinner. Watching TV. Sleeping peacefully while Sylvia lay awake at 3 in the morning trying to understand what had happened to her daughter. Maybe they never thought about Karissa at all. Maybe they'd forgotten her completely. That possibility was almost worse than the idea that they felt guilty. Because at least guilt would mean Karissa's death had weight. Had significance. Had left some kind of mark on the person who'd caused it. But to be forgotten by the person who killed you. To be erased completely from their consciousness. To mean so little that your death didn't even register as something worth remembering. That was a different kind of violation. A second murder. An erasure not just of life but of significance. The third anniversary came and went with even less attention than the second. No news coverage. No renewed interest. No tips called into silent witness. Just another day on the calendar that happened to mark 3 years since Karissa died. Sylvia held a small vigil. Just family. They gathered at Sylvia's house, lit candles, shared memories. Talked about Karissa not as a victim but as a person. As a daughter and mother and woman who'd had dreams and plans and a future that someone had stolen. Kyrie participated in the way 6-year-olds participate in things they don't fully understand. He was quiet. Confused. Aware that something sad was happening but not quite grasping the full weight of it. "We're remembering your mommy," Sylvia explained. "Remembering how much we loved her and how much we miss her." "I miss her too," Kyrie said. But his voice was uncertain. Because how do you miss someone you barely remember? How do you grieve for someone who's more concept than memory in your mind? He knew his mother from photographs now. From stories. From the way people talked about her in the past tense. But actual memories? Specific moments of being with her, hearing her voice, feeling her arms around him. Those were fading. Growing indistinct. Merging with the stories he'd been told until he couldn't always separate what he remembered from what he'd been taught to remember. That was another loss. Another theft. Not just Karissa's death, but Kyrie's forgetting. The natural erosion of memory that happens to all children who lose parents young. The way the actual person gets replaced gradually by the idealized version that family members describe. Sylvia tried to keep Karissa alive for him. Tried to share stories that would help him know who his mother really was. But she also knew it wasn't the same. Knowing about someone wasn't the same as knowing them. And Kyrie would grow up with an absence where direct knowledge should have been. He would grow up with questions that no one could answer. Not just about who killed his mother, but about who his mother was. What she sounded like. What she found funny. What she did when she was stressed. All the small, specific things that make a person real and three-dimensional and knowable. Those things were disappearing. Dying a second death. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Sylvia thought about contacting a private investigator. She'd considered it before. Had even gotten quotes from a few PIs who specialized in cold cases. But the cost was prohibitive. Thousands of dollars. Potentially tens of thousands. Money she didn't have. Money that would mean going into debt or selling things or making financial sacrifices she wasn't sure she could sustain. And for what? For the possibility, not even the guarantee, just the possibility, that a private investigator might find something the police had missed. Might uncover a lead that had been overlooked. Might ask the right question of the right person and finally break the case open. But they also might find nothing. Might spend months investigating and arrive at the same dead end the police had reached. Might take her money and her hope and give her back nothing but confirmation that the case was unsolvable. It was a gamble. A risk. And Sylvia didn't know if she could handle another disappointment. Another promising lead that went nowhere. Another surge of hope followed by crushing defeat. So she put off the decision. Kept the quotes filed away. Kept thinking about it without committing. Kept waiting for some kind of sign that would tell her whether hiring a private investigator was the right move or just another form of desperation. But the sign never came. Just more silence. More waiting. More days passing without answers. The world kept turning. That was the thing Sylvia couldn't quite reconcile. Her world had stopped on February 5, 2023. But the actual world, the one everyone else lived in, kept moving. People had weddings and babies and promotions and vacations. They worried about ordinary things. They complained about traffic and weather in their jobs. They lived full, normal lives that had nothing to do with Karissa's death. And Sylvia had to live in both worlds simultaneously. Had to exist in the stopped time of her grief while also functioning in the moving time of regular life. Had to pay bills and go to work and take care of Kyrie and maintain a household while carrying the weight of an unsolved murder. It was exhausting. Disorienting. Like trying to walk in two directions at once. Sometimes she resented the people around her for their ability to move on. For their ability to care about trivial things. For their ability to be happy while her daughter's killer walked free. But she also knew that resentment was unfair. Knew that people couldn't live in her grief with her. Knew that life had to continue even in the face of tragedy. Knew that the world couldn't stop turning just because her world had. Still. The resentment lingered. The feeling that if Karissa's death mattered, if it truly mattered, then the world should feel different. Should reflect the magnitude of the loss. Should acknowledge that something terrible had happened and nothing would ever be the same. But the world didn't work that way. The world was indifferent. It absorbed violence and tragedy and loss and kept spinning. Kept producing new days. Kept demanding that people who were broken find a way to keep functioning. And so Sylvia functioned. Because what else could she do? The third year brought a different kind of silence. Not the silence of a case going cold, that had already happened. This was the silence of resignation. Of a family slowly, painfully accepting that the answers they desperately needed might never come. That whoever killed Karissa had successfully disappeared into the noise of everyday life. That they'd gotten away with it. The phrase made Sylvia physically ill every time it crossed her mind. Gotten away with it. As if murder was something you could get away with. As if taking a life, destroying a family, leaving a child without a mother was just another crime that sometimes went unpunished. But that's exactly what it was. And the person who killed Karissa, whoever they were, wherever they were, was living proof. They were out there somewhere. Walking around. Maybe in Phoenix, maybe somewhere else by now. Maybe they'd moved on entirely. Changed cities. Changed lives. Maybe they thought about what they'd done sometimes. Maybe they felt guilt. Maybe they looked over their shoulder occasionally, wondering if today would be the day someone figured it out. Or maybe they didn't think about it at all anymore. Maybe Karissa's death was just a moment in their past. Something they'd moved beyond. Something that didn't keep them awake at night or haunt their quiet moments. That possibility, that Karissa's murder might mean nothing to the person who committed it, was almost worse than the murder itself. Sylvia started having dreams about the parking lot. Not memories, she hadn't been there that night. But her mind constructed the scene anyway. Filled in details based on the sparse facts she knew. Built a narrative from fragments and shadows and the terrible need to understand what had happened to her daughter. In the dreams, she was watching from a distance. Unable to move, unable to call out, unable to intervene. Just watching as Karissa's car pulled into that southeast parking lot. Watching as the engine stayed running. Watching as something happened, something the dream never showed her clearly, and then Karissa was gone. The dreams always ended the same way. With Sylvia trying to run toward the car, trying to reach her daughter, trying to do something, anything, to change the outcome. But her legs wouldn't work. Her voice wouldn't work. She was trapped in paralysis while Karissa died just out of reach. She would wake up gasping, heart pounding, disoriented. And then the reality would settle in. It wasn't a dream. Karissa was really dead. And there was nothing Sylvia could have done to prevent it because she hadn't even known it was happening until it was over. The dreams were her mind's way of processing the helplessness. The lack of control. The fact that her daughter had died and she hadn't been there. Hadn't protected her. Hadn't saved her. Rationally, Sylvia knew that wasn't her fault. Knew that you can't protect adult children from every danger. That Karissa's death wasn't something she could have prevented. But grief isn't rational. And the guilt that comes with losing a child, even an adult child, doesn't respond to logic. It just sits there, heavy and immovable, insisting that somehow, some way, this was preventable. That if only you'd done something differently, everything would be different. The park continued its daily rhythms, completely indifferent to what had happened there. During the day, it was still full of life. Joggers completed their loops around the paths. Families spread blankets on the grass for picnics. Children played soccer, their voices carrying across the open fields. The park had absorbed Karissa's death the way ground absorbs rain, completely, without trace. Sylvia drove past it sometimes. Not intentionally. Just because it was in central Phoenix, hard to avoid if you were going anywhere near downtown. And every time she passed, she felt a pull. A dark gravity that made her want to stop. To sit in that parking lot again. To try once more to feel something, understand something, connect to the last moments of Karissa's life. But she never did stop. Because she knew there was nothing to find there. The parking lot held no answers. No secrets. No connection to Karissa's spirit or presence or anything else. It was just asphalt and painted lines. Just a location where something terrible had happened and then life had moved on. The indifference bothered her more than it should have. She knew the park wasn't sentient. Knew it couldn't mourn or remember or care. But somehow, the fact that life continued there, that people laughed and played and lived their ordinary lives in the same space where Karissa had died, felt like a betrayal. Like the world was saying, this didn't matter. This tragedy was small enough to absorb and forget. This death changed nothing. But it had changed everything. For Sylvia. For Kyrie. For everyone who loved Karissa. The world just didn't notice. Kyrie's questions evolved as he got older. By age 6, he wasn't just asking if they'd caught the person who hurt his mother. He was asking deeper questions. Harder questions. Questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Why would someone hurt Mommy? She was nice. Did Mommy know the person who killed her? If they don't find who did it, does that mean they can hurt other people too? That last question had stopped Sylvia cold. Because she'd thought about it, of course. Wondered if Karissa's killer had killed before. Might kill again. Might be a danger to others. The police had given no indication that they thought this was a serial crime. No suggestion that Karissa's death was connected to other cases. But they also hadn't ruled it out publicly. And without knowing the motive, without understanding why Karissa had been killed, there was no way to assess whether the killer might strike again. Was there another family somewhere, living their ordinary lives, not knowing that a killer was in their orbit? Was there another young woman who was in danger and didn't know it? Or was Karissa's death isolated? Personal. A one-time act that wouldn't be repeated. The not knowing extended in all directions. Not just backward to the question of who and why, but forward to the question of what this meant for the future. For other potential victims. For the safety of the community. Sylvia didn't know how to answer Kyrie's question honestly without terrifying him. Without making him think that the world was full of murderers who could hurt anyone at any time with no consequences. Even though, in some ways, that was exactly what the world was. The support groups became both lifeline and mirror. Sylvia attended regularly now. Meetings with other families of murder victims. People who understood the specific shape of this grief. The specific weight of living with unanswered questions. In the meetings, people shared updates on their cases. Celebrated small victories, an arrest, a trial date, a conviction. Mourned setbacks, a dismissed case, an acquittal, a hung jury. Supported each other through the long, grinding process of seeking justice through a system that often seemed designed to frustrate rather than facilitate. But Sylvia rarely had updates to share. Karissa's case remained static. Unsolved. No movement. No news. Just ongoing silence from the police department and the slow, painful passage of time. She saw herself reflected in the faces of other families whose cases had gone cold. Saw the same exhaustion. The same resignation mixed with stubborn refusal to give up. The same anger at a system that had effectively abandoned them. Some of those families had been waiting 5 years for answers. 10 years. 20 years. Some had been waiting so long that the victim's siblings were now older than the victim ever got to be. That the victim's children, like Kyrie, had grown up entirely without their murdered parent. Those long-term families scared Sylvia. Because they were a future. They were what happened when cases didn't get solved. When justice didn't come. When you had to learn to live with the absence, with the not knowing, with the constant low-grade torture of unanswered questions. They were kind to her. welcomed her, shared their strategies for coping. But their presence also felt like a warning. Like a glimpse of what the next 10, 20, 30 years of her life might look like if Karissa's case stayed cold. And she didn't know if she had the strength for that. Relationships changed after Karissa's death. Some people didn't know how to be around grief. Didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to help. So they said nothing. Did nothing. Quietly faded from Sylvia's life, leaving empty spaces where friendships used to be. Sylvia understood, on some level. Understood that witnessing someone else's pain is uncomfortable. That people have their own problems and can't be expected to carry someone else's grief indefinitely. That there's only so much support you can offer before it becomes exhausting. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. Didn't make the abandonment feel less personal. Because that's what it felt like. Abandonment. People who had been close, who had promised to be there, who had said, "Call me anytime," in the immediate aftermath, those people disappeared. Stopped calling. Stopped texting. Made themselves scarce. And Sylvia was left with a smaller circle. A tighter orbit. Just the family members who couldn't leave because they were bound by blood and shared loss. Just the few friends who genuinely understood that grief doesn't have a timeline. That support isn't measured in weeks or months but in years. In however long it takes. The isolation was its own kind of loss. On top of losing Karissa, Sylvia had lost parts of her social world. Lost the version of herself that existed before tragedy. Lost the ability to engage in ordinary conversations without grief coloring everything. People would ask, "How are you?" and she never knew how to answer. Fine. She wasn't fine. Her daughter was dead and the killer was free and she was carrying weight that was crushing her. But saying that out loud made people uncomfortable. Made them regret asking. Made them find reasons to end the conversation quickly. So sometimes she just said, "Fine," and let them believe it. Let them think she was coping better than she was. Let them off the hook. It was easier than watching them squirm with discomfort at the reality of her pain. The media occasionally revisited Karissa's case. Usually around the anniversary of her death. A reporter would call, asking if Sylvia wanted to do an interview. Asking if there were any updates. If the family was planning a vigil or press conference. The first few years, Sylvia always said yes. Always agreed to be interviewed. Always hoped that this time, this article, this news segment, would be the one that generated the crucial tip. The one that brought forward the witness who would crack the case open. But nothing ever came of it. The articles would run, the segments would air, and then, silence. The same silence that had been there all along. By the third year, Sylvia was exhausted by the media cycle. Exhausted by telling Karissa's story over and over to reporters who seemed sympathetic but ultimately moved on to the next story, the next tragedy, the next family in crisis. She still did the interviews. But with less hope now. Less belief that media attention would make a difference. She did them because they kept Karissa's name in circulation. Because maybe, just maybe, someone who knew something would see one of these stories and finally decide to come forward. But she didn't believe it anymore. Not really. The hope had calcified into something harder. Something more like stubborn determination than actual optimism. She would keep doing this because she'd started doing it and she didn't know how to stop. Because stopping felt like giving up on Karissa. But the belief that it would lead somewhere, that was mostly gone. Kyrie started having nightmares. Not every night. But often enough that Sylvia recognized the pattern. He would wake up crying, confused, calling for his mother. And Sylvia would go to him, hold him, try to comfort him even though there was no real comfort to give. Because the nightmare was reality. His mother was gone. And no amount of soothing could change that. She took him to a child psychologist. Someone who specialized in trauma and grief. The psychologist explained that children process loss differently than adults. That at Kyrie's age, he was still working out what permanent meant. Still cycling through denial and acceptance, sometimes believing his mother might come back, other times understanding with painful clarity that she wouldn't. The nightmares were part of that processing. His mind trying to work through something it wasn't developmentally ready to fully comprehend. The psychologist recommended continued therapy. Creating spaces where Kyrie could talk about his mother. Keeping her memory alive through stories and photos. Helping him understand that grief was normal, that missing her was normal, that the pain wouldn't last forever even though it felt like it would. But there was a limit to what therapy could do. Because the trauma wasn't just the loss itself. It was the ongoing nature of the loss. The fact that the person who killed his mother was still out there. The fact that there was no justice. No closure. No sense that the wrong had been made right. How do you help a child process something that isn't finished? How do you teach acceptance when the story has no ending? The psychologist didn't have good answers to those questions. Just strategies for coping. For managing. For surviving. But survival wasn't the same as healing. And Kyrie deserved more than just survival. He deserved a mother who was alive. Barring that, he deserved justice for the mother who was taken from him. And he wasn't getting either. The detective who had worked Karissa's case transferred to a different division. Sylvia found out through a generic email from the department, informing her that a new detective would be taking over cold cases, including Karissa's. Providing new contact information. Thanking her for her patience as the department continued to pursue justice. She'd wanted to be angry about it. Wanted to feel betrayed that the person who knew Karissa's case was moving on. But she couldn't muster the energy for anger anymore. Because what did it matter? The first detective hadn't solved the case. There was no reason to think a second detective would have better luck. The case was cold because there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. Changing who was responsible for that insufficient evidence didn't change the fundamental problem. Still, she reached out to the new detective. Introduced herself. Asked if there were any plans to take a fresh look at the case. Any new investigative techniques that might be applied. Any reason to hope. The new detective was polite. Professional. Said all the right things about being committed to seeking justice. About cold cases sometimes getting solved years later when new information emerged or when technology advanced. But reading between the lines, Sylvia understood, don't get your hopes up. Don't expect miracles. Don't wait for us to solve this. If Karissa's case was going to be solved, it would be because of luck. Because someone's conscience finally got to them. Because a deathbed confession or a jailhouse conversation or some random chance encounter generated new information. Not because of active, determined police work. The case had effectively been shelved. Still open, technically. But not actively worked. Just waiting. Waiting for something that might never come. On the 3rd anniversary of Karissa's death, Sylvia did something different. She didn't organize a press conference. Didn't reach out to media. Didn't post on social media. Didn't do any of the things she'd done in previous years to mark the date. Instead, she took Kyrie to a park, not Steele Indian School Park, somewhere else entirely, and they had a picnic. Just the two of them. They ate sandwiches and talked about Karissa. About memories Kyrie had, the few he could still access from when he was 3. About stories Sylvia told him, trying to keep his mother alive in his mind. They didn't talk about the investigation. Didn't talk about justice or the lack thereof. Didn't talk about who killed her or why or whether they'd ever be caught. They just talked about Karissa. About who she was. What she loved. What she dreamed about. The kind of mother she'd been. The kind of person she'd been. And for those few hours, sitting in the sunshine with her grandson, Sylvia felt something other than grief and anger and exhaustion. She felt love. Just simple, pure love for the daughter she'd lost and the grandson she was raising. It didn't fix anything. Didn't answer any questions. Didn't bring Karissa back or solve her murder or make the world feel fair again. But it reminded Sylvia why she kept going. Why she got up every morning and put one foot in front of the other and continued existing even when existing felt impossible. Because Kyrie needed her. Because Karissa's memory deserved to be honored. Because love, even love for someone who's gone, is worth carrying. Even when it's the heaviest thing you'll ever hold. Time has a way of dulling sharp edges. Not erasing them. Not making them disappear. But smoothing them just enough that you can hold them without bleeding constantly. That you can carry them without feeling like they're cutting you open every second of every day. For years after Karissa's death, Sylvia had learned to exist alongside the pain. Not beyond it. Not through it. Just alongside it. The grief was still there, constant as breathing. But she'd developed a relationship with it. Had learned its rhythms. Had figured out which days would be harder and which days would be almost manageable. Kyrie was 7 now. In 2nd grade. Starting to form memories that wouldn't include his mother at all. Starting to become a person whose entire childhood would be defined by absence. He asked fewer questions about the investigation now. Not because he'd stopped caring, but because he'd learned what the answers would be. No, they haven't caught anyone yet. No, there are no new leads. No, we don't know when, or if, we'll ever know what happened. The questions he asked now were different. More philosophical. More existential. Do you think Mommy knows about me? Like, does she know I got an A on my spelling test? When I grow up, will I look like her? Do you think she's proud of me? Those questions broke Sylvia's heart in new ways. Because they weren't about the murder anymore. They were about a child trying to maintain a connection to a parent who existed only in stories and photographs. A child trying to build a relationship with someone who couldn't respond. Couldn't affirm him. Couldn't tell him directly that yes, she was proud. Yes, she loved him. Yes, she would have been there for every spelling test and soccer game and birthday party if she'd been given the choice. But she hadn't been given the choice. Someone had taken that from her. Taken it from Kyrie. Taken it from all of them. And that person was still out there. Still free. Still living whatever life they'd built on top of the one they'd destroyed. The park had become just a park again. Sylvia could drive past it now without feeling the pull. Without feeling the need to stop and sit in that parking lot and try to commune with ghosts that weren't there. It was just a place. Geography. Coordinates on a map. The significance she'd given it was something she'd imposed, not something inherent. Karissa's last moments had happened there, but Karissa herself, her essence, her spirit, whatever you wanted to call the part of a person that matters, wasn't there. Had never been there, really. She was in Kyrie's face when he smiled a certain way. In the photos on Sylvia's wall. In the memories that Sylvia clung to and retold and tried desperately to keep vivid even as time worked to fade them. That's where Karissa lived now. Not in a parking lot. Not in a case file. But in the people who remembered her. Who loved her. Who refused to let her become just another statistic. It was a small kind of immortality. But it was something. The case file still existed somewhere in the Phoenix Police Department. Stored in a cabinet or a database. Tagged as unsolved. Waiting for the day when new information might breathe life back into it. Waiting for a witness to come forward. For a deathbed confession. For some stroke of luck that would finally provide the missing piece. But Sylvia no longer checked in regularly with the cold case detective. No longer called every few months asking for updates. She'd learned that there wouldn't be updates. That the investigation had reached its natural limit. That unless something changed dramatically, the case would remain exactly as it was, open but inactive. Unsolved. Unresolved. She'd made peace with that. Or something like peace. Something that resembled acceptance even if it didn't feel like it. Because what else could she do? She couldn't solve the case herself. Couldn't force witnesses to come forward. Couldn't make evidence appear where none existed. Couldn't will the universe into providing answers just because she desperately needed them. All she could do was keep living. Keep raising Kyrie. Keep honoring Karissa's memory. Keep carrying the weight. Some days, that felt like enough. Like doing those things was its own form of justice. Its own way of saying that Karissa mattered. That her life had value. That her death wouldn't be forgotten just because her murder went unpunished. Other days, it felt like nothing. Like a hollow consolation prize. Like trying to convince herself that survival was the same as victory when really, she'd just learned to endure defeat. There were moments, random, unexpected moments, when the grief would ambush her with the same intensity as it had in the beginning. She'd see a young woman with a child. Mother and son, laughing together. And for just a second, her brain would misfire. Would think, that should be Karissa and Kyrie. Would imagine a parallel universe where things went differently. Where Karissa came home from Yuma that Sunday night. Where she's still here, still raising her son, still building her career, still living. And then reality would crash back in. That parallel universe didn't exist. Karissa was gone. And all Sylvia had was this universe, this reality, where loss was permanent and questions went unanswered and killers sometimes got away with it. Those moments of acute grief were harder in some ways than the constant low-grade ache. Because they reminded her that the pain wasn't diminishing. Wasn't healing. It was just being managed. Compartmentalized. Shoved into corners where it couldn't interfere with daily functioning. But it was still there. All of it. As raw and fresh as the day she first learned Karissa was dead. Time didn't heal. It just taught you how to live wounded. Kyrie found a photo once. Hidden in a box of Sylvia's belongings. It was from the crime scene. Not graphic. Not showing Karissa. Just the parking lot. The car. Police tape. The scene from a distance. Sylvia had kept it, though she didn't know why. Maybe as evidence. Maybe as proof that this had really happened. Maybe because throwing it away felt like erasing something important even though looking at it caused pain. Kyrie had stared at the photo for a long time before showing it to Sylvia. When he finally brought it to her, his face was serious. Older than his 7 years. "Is this where it happened?" he asked. Sylvia had considered lying. Considered saying she didn't know, or that it was just an old photo from something else. But Kyrie deserved honesty. Deserved to know the truth about his mother's death, even when the truth was painful. "Yes," she'd said quietly. "That's where the police found her." Kyrie nodded slowly. Processing. "Then, it looks like a normal place." And that was the thing, wasn't it? Violence happened in normal places. Tragedy struck in ordinary parking lots. Lives ended in locations that held no inherent danger, no warning, no indication that something terrible was about to happen. "It is a normal place," Sylvia confirmed. "Bad things can happen anywhere." She'd regretted saying it immediately. Regretted potentially making him afraid of the world. But he needed to know. Needed to understand that danger wasn't always obvious. That sometimes terrible things happened for no reason, in normal places, to good people. It was a hard lesson. But living with his mother's unsolved murder meant he'd have to learn it eventually anyway. The support group had taught Sylvia something important: you never stop being the family of a murder victim. It becomes part of your identity. Part of how you introduce yourself in certain contexts. Part of how you understand yourself in the world. She was Sylvia Hamilton. Mother. Grandmother. And the mother of Karissa Hamilton, who was murdered in Phoenix in February 2023. That last part came up more often than you'd think. At victims' rights events. In support group meetings. When meeting other families going through similar tragedies. When advocates or reporters or researchers reached out about unsolved cases. It had become a role she never auditioned for. A position she never wanted. But one she inhabited nonetheless. And in that role, she'd learn things. About the criminal justice system. About victims' rights. About the statistics of unsolved homicides. About how police departments prioritize cases. About which victims get attention and which get forgotten. About the gaps in the system that allow killers to disappear. She'd become an expert in something she never wanted to know anything about. But that expertise gave her purpose. Gave her a way to channel the anger and grief and frustration. She volunteered now with organizations that supported families of murder victims. Shared her story at events. Advocated for more resources for cold case units. Tried to make something meaningful from the meaningless loss of her daughter. It didn't bring Karissa back. Didn't solve her murder. But it made Sylvia feel like she was doing something. Like she was fighting back against the randomness and injustice and cruelty that had taken her daughter. Like she was making sure that Karissa's death, while unpunished, at least wasn't completely without purpose. Every February 5th, Sylvia woke up with the weight already there. Another year. Another anniversary. Another marker of time passing without resolution. The family no longer organized public events. No press conferences. No vigils. They'd learned that those things didn't generate leads. Didn't bring forward witnesses. Didn't change anything except making them relive the trauma in front of cameras. Now they marked the day privately. Went to Karissa's grave. Shared memories. Cried together. Then went home and tried to make it through the rest of the day. It was quieter. More personal. Less performative. And in some ways, more honest. Because this was the reality of living with an unsolved murder. Not dramatic public appeals. Not media attention. Just quiet, persistent grief that had to be carried every single day, with one day per year being slightly heavier than the rest. There were nights when Sylvia let herself imagine that the case would be solved someday. Not because she believed it, but because the imagination itself was a kind of relief. A brief escape from the reality of permanent uncertainty. She'd imagine a phone call. A detective's voice, gentle but excited, "We got him. We know who killed Karissa." She'd imagine the arrest. The trial. The conviction. The moment when she'd finally get to look the killer in the eye and ask, "Why? Why my daughter?" She'd imagine having that answer. Having the closure. Having the piece of information that would make the nightmare make sense. But then she'd open her eyes, and the fantasy would dissolve, and she'd be back in reality. Where the phone didn't ring. Where no arrests were made. Where the questions remained unanswered and probably always would. The fantasies were both comfort and torture. They gave her something to hold on to. But they also reminded her of everything she didn't have. Everything she might never have. Kyrie would grow up with a hole where his mother should be. He'd graduate elementary school without her there. Middle school. High school. College, maybe, if he went. He'd learn to drive without her nervously sitting in the passenger seat. He'd go on first dates without her advice. He'd navigate heartbreak and success and failure and all the ordinary moments of growing up without the person who brought him into the world. And someday, maybe, he'd have children of his own. Children who would never meet their grandmother. Who would only know her through stories and photographs. Who would grow up knowing that someone in their family tree was murdered and the killer was never caught. The absence would ripple forward. Through generations. Through time. A permanent disruption in the family story. That was the true cost of unsolved murder. Not just the immediate loss. But the ongoing absence. The future that was stolen. The relationships that never formed. The moments that never happened. All of it, gone. Because someone pulled a trigger one Sunday night in a parking lot and then walked away. Somewhere, right now, that person is living their life. Maybe they're eating breakfast. Maybe they're at work. Maybe they're with family, celebrating a birthday or watching a movie or doing something completely ordinary. Maybe they think about Karissa sometimes. Maybe they don't. Maybe they feel remorse. Maybe they justified it to themselves long ago. Maybe they've convinced themselves it wasn't really their fault. That Karissa was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That circumstances forced their hand. That it was somehow necessary or unavoidable or not as bad as people made it seem. Or maybe they feel nothing. Maybe Karissa's death is just a fact from their past. Something that happened. Something they've moved on from. There's no way to know. No way to understand the interior life of someone who could kill another person and then return to normalcy. Who could destroy a family and then continue existing as if nothing had changed. But they're out there. Living. Breathing. Free. While Karissa is in the ground. While Kyrie is without his mother. While Sylvia carries weight that will never lift. That's the reality. That's the truth that has to be lived with. If you're watching this, if you've stayed with Karissa's story this far, maybe you're wondering what you can do. Maybe you're thinking about unsolved cases in your own community. About families who are living the same nightmare. About victims whose stories have faded from public consciousness but whose families still wait for justice. The truth is, there's no simple answer. No easy way to solve cold cases or force witnesses to come forward or make the system work better. But awareness matters. Attention matters. Refusing to let these stories disappear matters. If Karissa's story affected you, share it. Talk about it. Remember that every unsolved case represents a real person whose life mattered. A real family who deserves answers. And if you know something, anything, about any unsolved case, please come forward. Even if it seems small. Even if you're not sure it matters. Let the investigators decide what's relevant. Don't let fear or uncertainty keep you silent when your information might be the piece that finally brings someone justice. Subscribing to this channel helps keep stories like Karissa's alive. Leaving a comment, sharing with someone who cares about true crime, engaging with the content, it all helps prevent these cases from being completely forgotten. But more than that, it reminds us that behind every unsolved murder is a real family, still waiting, still hoping, still carrying impossible weight. Karissa Danielle Hamilton was 29 years old when she died. She was a mother. A daughter. A student. A woman with dreams of becoming a sports journalist. A woman who loved her son more than anything. A woman who was trying to build a better future. She drove from Yuma to Phoenix on a Sunday in February. And somewhere between leaving her family's house and arriving home, something happened. Something that ended with her sitting in a car in a parking lot, engine running, single gunshot wound, life gone. No one knows why. No one knows who. No one knows the full story of what happened in those hours. What decisions led her to that parking lot? What circumstances resulted in her death? The case remains unsolved. The questions remain unanswered. The killer remains free. And Karissa's family remains in the aftermath. Living with absence. Living with uncertainty. Living with the terrible knowledge that sometimes, bad things happen to good people and justice never comes. Kyrie is growing up without his mother. Sylvia is living without her daughter. The world keeps turning, indifferent to their pain. And somewhere, someone knows what happened. Someone knows why. Someone knows who. They're just not telling. The engine that never stopped running has long since been turned off. The car has been processed, documented, returned, eventually sold. The parking lot has been resurfaced. The seasons have changed and changed again. The city has moved on. But the question remains. Who killed Karissa Hamilton? And why? End. This has been the story of Karissa Hamilton. A life interrupted. A case unsolved. A family still waiting for answers that may never come. If you have any information about Karissa's death, please contact the Phoenix Police Department or Silent Witness. Even the smallest detail might matter. Thank you for bearing witness to her story.